The heavy snowstorm battering the windows of O'Hare International Airport was nothing compared to the icy glare Senator Victoria Kingsley shot at the boy standing in the aisle of first class. Outside, the Chicago wind howled, threatening to delay thousands of passengers desperate to get home for Thanksgiving. But inside the exclusive cabin of American Airlines Flight 224, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees the moment Jalen Carter stepped on board. Jalen stood just 4 feet 9 inches tall, a small figure swallowed by a faded, oversized gray hoodie that hung loosely off his thin frame. To the casual observer, he looked like he had wandered into the wrong terminal, let alone the wrong cabin. His sneakers were scuffed at the toes, and he clutched a worn, cracked leather satchel to his chest as if it contained the crown jewels. He adjusted his thick, black-rimmed glasses, his eyes darting nervously around the cabin that smelled of pine air freshener and expensive leather. He found row 2, double-checked his boarding pass, and quietly slipped into seat 2A by the window. He didn't touch the complimentary champagne or the hot towel. He simply stared out at the swirling snow, whispering a silent prayer of gratitude for the scholarship that had made this journey possible. The peace didn't last. A flurry of movement at the cabin door announced the arrival of Senator Victoria Kingsley. Dressed in a sharp charcoal Chanel suit that cost more than Jalen's entire wardrobe, she looked every bit the powerful politician she was, except for the frantic expression on her face. In one arm, she balanced a squirming, whimpering 10-month-old baby Lucas. In the other, she juggled a designer diaper bag and a cell phone pressed to her ear. She was already shouting about budget cuts and incompetent staff before she even reached row 2. But her conversation cut off abruptly when she saw who was sitting next to her assigned seat. She froze, her eyes narrowing as they swept over Jalen's gray hoodie. She didn't see a 12-year-old boy. She saw a threat. She saw a stereotype. She turned sharply to Sarah, the flight attendant who was trying to help her with her bag. "Excuse me," Victoria's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "There must be a mistake. Why is there an unaccompanied youth in my row?" Sarah blinked, confused. "I'm sorry, Senator. That's a ticketed passenger." "Ticketed?" Victoria let out a scoff that sounded like a bark. She shifted the fussing baby to her other hip, her gold bracelets jangling. "Look at him. He clearly snuck up here from economy while the gate agents were distracted, probably looking for open bags. I paid for safety and exclusivity, not to sit next to a potential security risk. I need you to escort him back to where he belongs." The cabin went quiet. The businessman in row 1 lowered his newspaper. An elderly woman in row 3 pursed her lips but said nothing. Jalen felt the heat rise in his cheeks, burning beneath his dark skin. He tightened his grip on his father's leather satchel, his knuckles turning lighter. He wanted to disappear. He wanted to run. But he remembered his father's voice, steady and kind. "Dignity is not what people give you, son. It's what you keep for yourself." Victoria didn't wait for the flight attendant to answer. She leaned over the seat, looming over Jalen, her perfume overpowering the air. "Listen, kid," she said, her voice dripping with a poisonous mix of exhaustion and prejudice. "This isn't a playground, and I am not in the mood for games. Grab your little bag and go back to coach before I call the air marshal and have you removed for trespassing." Jalen took a slow breath. He didn't shrink away. He didn't shout. He turned his head slowly, lifting his chin just enough to meet her gaze. Jalen adjusts his thick glasses, looks her dead in the eye, and speaks with a calm that betrays his age. "I belong in seat 2A, ma'am. And the plane is waiting for you to sit down." The fasten seatbelt sign chimed with a mocking cheerfulness, trapping Victoria in the velvet prison of seat 2B, mere inches from the boy she despised. She let out an exasperated sigh, loud enough for the entire front cabin to hear, and aggressively smoothed the lapel of her stained Chanel jacket. The plane was taxiing slowly toward the runway, joining a long line of aircraft delayed by the Thanksgiving rush, but inside the cabin, the tension was rising faster than the jet fuel fumes outside. Victoria immediately pressed the call button. When Sarah appeared, she didn't even look up. "Double vodka tonic. Light on the tonic. And bring me some napkins. This situation is giving me a migraine." She gestured vaguely at Jalen, who had shrunk as far into the window corner as physics allowed. He had pulled a stack of papers from his satchel, trying to make himself invisible behind a printout titled Pediatric Adrenal Crisis. Across the aisle, a gray-haired businessman in seat 1C caught Victoria's eye and shook his head sympathetically. "Unbelievable," he muttered. "You pay $5,000 for a ticket and they let just anyone in. Standards have really dropped." "Tell me about it," Victoria replied, her voice warming with the validation. "It's a safety issue, really. You don't know who these people are." In row 3, Frank Miller, a retired war correspondent with tired eyes and a camera instinct that never slept, watched the exchange. He didn't nod. He didn't agree. Instead, he quietly pulled his smartphone from his pocket, checked the battery percentage, and rested it on his knee, screen down. He had seen enough conflicts in his life to know when a battle line was being drawn, and the silence from the boy in the hoodie spoke louder than the senator's complaints. But the real noise was coming from Victoria's lap. Baby Lucas wasn't settling. His cry had shifted from a fussy whimper to a high-pitched, rhythmic keening that grated on the nerves. He turned his head away from the bottle Victoria tried to shove into his mouth, arching his back in obvious distress. "Stop it, Lucas," Victoria hissed, juggling the bottle and her drink. "Mommy has a headache. Don't be difficult like that, useless nanny." She bounced him on her knee, but the movement was mechanical, devoid of comfort. She treated him like a malfunctioning accessory rather than a child in pain. Jalen lowered his medical papers. He couldn't help it. He had spent too many hours in his father's clinic not to notice the signs. The baby's cry wasn't anger. It was agony. He peered over the armrest, his eyes fixing on Lucas's face. The skin around the baby's mouth looked mottled, and his lips were pale and dry. "Ma'am," Jalen whispered, his voice trembling slightly. Is he okay? He looks pale." Victoria whipped her head around, her eyes flashing. "Don't look at him. And don't speak to us." She turned her back on him, shielding Lucas from Jalen's gaze as if his concern was contagious. The engines roared to life, a deep vibration that rattled the floorboards. The plane surged forward, picking up speed. As the wheels left the tarmac and the nose lifted toward the gray sky, the change in cabin pressure hit the passengers. For most, it was just a pop in the ears. For baby Lucas, it was the final straw. He let out a scream that curdled the blood, a sound of pure, unadulterated suffering. Then, his little body convulsed. He vomited violently, not milk, but a yellowish bilious fluid all over the front of Victoria's expensive suit and onto the leather armrest. The smell of acid filled the small cabin instantly. Victoria shrieks in disgust, pushing the baby away. In that split second of rejection, Lucas goes silent. Too silent. His little arm flops down, revealing a silver medical ID bracelet on his wrist. Silence in a nursery is peaceful. Silence on a turbulent flight is terrifying. The silence coming from seat 2B was the sound of death approaching. The plane had just leveled off at cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign flicking off with a soft ping, but the relief that usually accompanies that sound was absent in the front cabin. The air was thick with the smell of acrid bile and expensive perfume, a nauseating combination that made passengers turn away. Victoria was frantic, grabbing napkins from the flight attendant's tray with shaking hands, dabbing furiously at her ruined Chanel suit. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, her voice trembling with anger rather than concern. "Absolutely ridiculous. I'm going to sue the agency that sent that nanny away." She looked down at Lucas, expecting him to be wailing, to be demanding attention as he always did. But Lucas was draped over her arm like a wet rag doll. His eyes were half open but unseeing, rolled back slightly into his head. His chest wasn't moving. "Lucas." Victoria stopped scrubbing her jacket. Her annoyance evaporated in a millisecond, replaced by a cold, jagged shard of terror. She shook him, gently at first, then harder. "Lucas. Baby? Wake up." The baby didn't respond. His skin had turned a terrifying shade of gray-blue. "He's not breathing." Victoria's scream tore through the hush of the cabin, primal and raw. "Help. Someone help my baby." Sarah, the flight attendant, dropped the tray of drinks she was holding. Plastic cups bounced across the carpet. She rushed to row 2, her face pale. "Senator? What's wrong?" He's not breathing. Do something. Victoria shoved the limp infant toward Sarah, her composure completely shattered. She was no longer a senator. She was just a terrified mother watching her world end. Sarah grabbed the cabin interphone, her voice cracking over the PA system. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a medical emergency. Is there a doctor on board? Any medical personnel, please identify yourself immediately." The cabin waited. Seconds ticked by like hours. The businessman in 1C stared resolutely at his shoes. The elderly woman in row 3 clutched her rosary beads. Frank Miller stood up in row 4, scanning the faces, hoping for a savior. But no one moved. No hands went up. The silence stretched, suffocating and absolute. In seat 2A, Jalen sat frozen. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He saw the silver bracelet dangling from Lucas's limp wrist. The letters engraved on it caught the cabin light: adrenal insufficiency, cortisol dependent. The puzzle pieces clicked into place with terrifying clarity. The vomiting. The dehydration from the dry cabin air. The stress of the flight. It wasn't just a stomach bug. It was an Addisonian crisis. The baby's body was shutting down because it couldn't produce the hormone needed to keep his heart beating. Fear gripped Jalen's throat. He was 12. He wasn't a doctor. He was just a kid in a hoodie who liked reading his dad's old journals. What if he was wrong? What if he made it worse? Then, he heard a voice in his head. Not the senator's screeching, but a deep, calm baritone. In a crisis, panic is the enemy. Knowledge is the shield. It was his father, Dr. Marcus Carter. Jalen took a deep breath, inhaling the stale plain air, and let the fear drain out of him. He unbuckled his seatbelt. The metallic click sounded like a gunshot in the quiet cabin. He stood up. He reached into his worn leather satchel and pulled out the one thing he treasured most, his father's silver stethoscope. He stepped into the aisle. Victoria, blinded by panic and seeing only the boy she had branded a thug moving toward her son, threw out a hand to block him. Her eyes were wild. "Get back. Don't touch him. Don't you dare touch him." Jalen didn't flinch. He didn't step back. He didn't say "yes, ma'am" or look down at his sneakers. For the first time in his life, he looked at an adult not with deference, but with authority. He stepped past her blocking arm, his movement fluid and precise. Jalen ignores her command. He pulls out his stethoscope and the emergency protocol sheet. His voice commands the entire cabin. "He's in adrenal shock, Senator. I need the medical kit, and I need it now." The cabin was so quiet you could hear the ice rattling in the abandoned drink glasses, but for Jalen, the only sound that mattered was the fading rhythm of a baby's heart. He knelt in the narrow aisle, the plush carpet digging into his knees, his world narrowing down to the tiny, blue-tinged form of Lucas Kingsley. The smell of expensive perfume and vomit still lingered, but Jalen didn't smell it anymore. He smelled antiseptic. He smelled urgency. Sarah arrived with the red emergency medical kit, her hands trembling as she unzipped it. "I have it," she stammered. "What do you need?" "Hydrocortisone," Jalen said. His voice didn't waver. It wasn't the voice of a 12-year-old boy anymore. It was the voice of a clinician. "Injectable." And a 3 cubic centimeter syringe. "Now." Victoria, huddled in her seat with her hands pressed over her mouth, made a choked sound of protest. You're going to inject him? You're just a child." Her eyes darted around the cabin, looking for a real adult to intervene, but the only adults present were staring at Jalen with a mixture of horror and desperate hope. "Senator, please," Sarah said firmly, placing a hand on Victoria's shoulder to keep her seated. "Let him work. He's the only one who knows what to do." Jalen snapped on a pair of latex gloves from the kit, a movement so practiced it recalled the hundreds of hours he spent shadowing his father in the clinic, watching Dr. Marcus Carter save lives in the back rooms of underfunded community centers. He wasn't Jalen the thug or Jalen the charity case right now. He was Dr. Carter's son. "Expose his thigh," Jalen ordered. Sarah hesitated for a fraction of a second, then obeyed, unbuttoning Lucas's onesie. The baby's skin was cold to the touch, mottled like marble. Jalen took the vial Sarah handed him. He held it up to the light, checking the label. "Hydrocortisone sodium succinate. Alcohol wipe," he requested. He tore the packet open with his teeth, never taking his eyes off the injection site. He wiped the tiny patch of skin on Lucas's thigh in a circular motion, just like his dad taught him. Clean the canvas before you paint, son. In row 4, Frank Miller held his phone steady, zooming in. On the screen, the image was striking. The rough, pilled fabric of Jalen's oversized gray hoodie contrasting sharply with the sterile, gleaming plastic of the syringe. It was a visual collision of two worlds: the poverty Victoria despised and the medical expertise she desperately needed. The businessman in row 1, who had earlier scoffed at Jalen's presence, had his eyes closed, his lips moving in silent prayer. The entire cabin seemed to be holding its collective breath, suspended in the thin air at 30,000 feet. Jalen uncapped the needle. His hand hovered over the baby's leg. For a split second, a wave of doubt crashed over him. I'm 12. If I'm wrong. But then he looked at Lucas's face, peaceful and deadly still. He didn't see a senator's son. He just saw a patient. He pushed the needle in. Smooth. Deep into the muscle. Lucas didn't even flinch. He was too far gone. Jalen depressed the plunger, counting the seconds in his head. 1, 2, 3. He withdrew the needle and immediately pressed a cotton ball over the spot. Come on, little man, Jalen whispered, his voice cracking slightly, betraying the terrified child beneath the doctor's demeanor. Come back to us. Fight. He checked his watch. 10 seconds. 20 seconds. Nothing. The baby remained limp. Victoria let out a low, keen wail, burying her face in her hands. Jalen kept his fingers on the baby's wrist, searching for a pulse that was thready and weak. Work. Please work. A agonizing pause. Then a gasp. Lucas's chest heaves. A loud, lusty cry erupts from the baby, filling the silent cabin. Color floods back into his pale cheeks. As the plane descended toward Washington, D.C., the applause for Jalen was deafening, but the silence between him and Senator Kingsley was louder than ever. The pilot had announced the successful medical intervention over the intercom, and passengers who had previously looked at Jalen with suspicion were now craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the hero in the hoodie. Strangers reached out to pat his shoulder as he walked back to his seat, but Jalen didn't smile. He just nodded politely, his eyes fixed on the seat back in front of him, feeling an exhaustion that went deeper than his bones. When the aircraft finally docked at Reagan National Airport, the cabin door burst open, not for passengers to disembark, but for a team of paramedics to rush in. The lead medic, a burly man named Rodriguez, went straight to Victoria and the baby. He checked Lucas's vitals, shone a light in his eyes, and listened to his chest. After a tense minute, Rodriguez stood up and looked around. Who administered the hydrocortisone? Jalen raised his hand slowly. I did, sir. 25 milligrams. Intramuscular. Rodriguez looked at the small boy, then at the syringe wrapper on the tray table. He shook his head in disbelief. Kid, you didn't just help. You nailed the dosage. You saved his brain function. Maybe his life. That was textbook. Victoria let out a sob of relief, clutching Lucas to her chest. She looked at Jalen, really looked at him for the first time. The arrogance was gone, washed away by tears and adrenaline. She stood up on shaky legs and reached for her purse. Her hands were trembling as she pulled out a checkbook. I don't know what to say, Victoria stammered, tearing a check out. You saved my son. I want to reward you. Name your price. A scholarship? A house for your family? I have connections. I can get you into any school. I owe you everything. Jalen watched her frantic attempts to monetize her gratitude. It was the only language she knew how to speak. He stood up, zipping his worn leather satchel closed. He adjusted the strap over his shoulder, the weight of his father's stethoscope pressing against his chest. You can't pay me, Senator, Jalen said softly. And you can't pay my father back either. Victoria froze, her pen hovering over the check. Your father? I'd be happy to make the check out to him. What is his name? Jalen took a step closer. The cabin was emptying out, but the air between them felt pressurized. You already know his name, Jalen said. Dr. Marcus Carter. He was a pediatric specialist in Chicago. Last year, he applied for the Kingsley Medical Grant from your foundation. He wanted to research affordable screening for adrenal crisis in low-income communities. To save kids like me. To save kids like Lucas. Victoria's brow furrowed. The name stirred a vague, uncomfortable memory in the back of her mind, a stack of applications she had reviewed over a power lunch, a quick signature on a rejection letter. You denied him personally, Jalen continued, his voice steady but heavy with grief. You wrote on the rejection letter that his research wasn't fiscally responsible because poor patients don't generate enough profit to justify the investment. My dad died of cancer 6 months later, still trying to fund that research on his own. The checkbook falls from Victoria's hand. She remembers. The realization hits her like a physical blow. The man she let die left a son who just saved the only thing she loves. 2 weeks later, the snow had melted in D.C., and so had the ice around Senator Victoria Kingsley's heart. The city was preparing for Thanksgiving, but the biggest story wasn't the turkey pardoning at the White House. It was the video titled "The Boy in the Hoodie, A Lesson for America." Filmed by Frank Miller, the clip had garnered 50 million views in 10 days. It showed the trembling hands of a powerful senator contrasted with the steady, capable hands of a boy she had dismissed as a thug. It forced a nation to look in the mirror, and Victoria Kingsley was the first to blink. On the morning of Thanksgiving, Jalen sat in his small living room, watching the news on an old television set. Victoria was at a podium, but she didn't look like the woman on the plane. She wore a simple dress, minimal jewelry, and her voice lacked its usual sharp edge. I made a mistake, she told the gathered press, looking directly into the camera. I judged a book by its cover, and it almost cost me my son's life. I cannot change the past, but I can change the law. She held up a thick binder. Today, I am introducing the Marcus Carter Children's Health Act, fully funding the research I once denied. We will find these diseases before they become crises. We will listen before we judge. Jalen felt a lump in his throat. On the coffee table in front of him lay a thick envelope from the Kingsley Foundation. It wasn't a check. It was a letter guaranteeing a full, expenses-paid scholarship to the Johns Hopkins Young Scholars Program, followed by medical school tuition. It was the future his father had dreamed of for him, signed by the woman who had once tried to erase it. Later that afternoon, the autumn sun cast long shadows over the quiet rows of headstones at the cemetery. Jalen walked the familiar path to his father's grave, the leaves crunching softly under his worn sneakers. He was dressed in his best Sunday suit, but underneath the jacket, he still wore the gray hoodie. It wasn't a symbol of poverty anymore. It was his cape. When he reached the grave, he stopped. Someone had been there before him. Lying on the cold granite marker of Dr. Marcus Carter was a single white rose and a bound copy of the new Health Act. Standing 100 yards away, near the cemetery gates, was a solitary figure in a black coat. Victoria Kingsley didn't approach him. She didn't wave. She simply bowed her head in a gesture of profound respect, then turned and walked away, leaving Jalen to have his moment with his father. Jalen knelt down. He unzipped his satchel and took out the silver stethoscope. He placed the cold metal against the stone, as if trying to listen to a heartbeat that was no longer there, but was echoed in the beating hearts of every child the new law would save. She listened, Dad, Jalen whispered to the wind. Finally, he stood up, wiping a stray tear from behind his thick glasses. The air was crisp and clean, smelling of winter and hope. As he walked back toward the entrance, a group of elderly veterans on a bench stopped their conversation. They saw the boy. They saw the hoodie. They didn't clutch their wallets or look away. Instead, they straightened up, smiled warmly, and one by one, they tipped their hats in reverence. Jalen turns to leave, walking past a group of elderly people who smile and tip their hats to him. The boy in the hoodie is no longer a threat. He is America's hope. The screen fades to black with the text, "Never judge a book by its cover." Sometimes, the quietest people carry the loudest strength, and the heroes we need don't always look the way we expect. True nobility isn't found in a designer suit or a prestigious title, but in the willingness to help a stranger without asking for anything in return. Let Jalen's story remind us all to look past the surface and lead with our hearts, because the person you underestimate today might be the very one who saves you tomorrow. If this story touched you, Please share it to spread a little more kindness in the world.